Hello, ladies, gentlemen, and assorted beings, and welcome to my history of the 1951 Formula One season. This season, we see Fangio versus Ascari. In the run-up to this season, well, before World War II, we had the European Championship, which was the most direct predecessor of the modern Formula One Championship. In its later years, it was dominated by Mercedes, but in the immediate post-war era, Mercedes was banned from racing due to the whole World War II business. The post-war Formula One regulations were created in 1946, and in 1950, in response to MotoGP being created, the Motorcycle World Championship, the first Formula One World Championship was held and would be dominated by in 1950, in response to MotoGP being created, the first Motorcycle World Championship, the first Formula One World Championship was held and would be dominated by Alfa Romeo, with the title ultimately going to Nino Farina after a close finish against Fangio. For 1951, the calendar would be slightly revised into an 8-race calendar, technically. The Spanish and German Grand Prix at the Nürburgring and Pedralbes were added to the calendar, while the Monaco Grand Prix was removed. The Indianapolis 500 was still on the calendar, although no European drivers would go to it. The point system used at the time was still the 8-6-4-3-2, with one per fastest lap, and still only the best 4 races counted, which isn't as strange as it sounds considering the horrible reliability of the time. Now, the defending champions coming into 1951 are Alfa Romeo and their Alfa Romeo 159 Alfetta, still built using almost entirely pre-war parts, including engine blocks. They were one of the only teams, along with Ferrari, that were actually prepared to appear with at least 3 cars at every race. They had dominated 1950, taking 6 wins out of 6 races. The Alfetta itself was designed for the pre-war Voiturette class, but had been steadily upgraded since. It had a new rear engine and rear suspension and engine for 1951. The 1.5-liter supercharged inline 8 produced 420 horsepower, and it ran on Pirelli tires. However, that engine design from before the war was now really being pushed to its limits, and the fuel economy of the car would be appalling by 1951, something like 1.9 liters per kilogram or 1.2 miles per gallon. They maintained mostly the same lineup as the previous year, headed by Juan Manuel Fangio and Giuseppe Nino Farina. Farina was the defending champion, actually, 44-year-old Italian, protege of the pre-war legend Tazio Nuvolari, a long-time Alfa Romeo driver. His uncle had founded Pininfarina. In 1950, he won 3 races and beat Fangio to the title by 3 points. Of course, his major rival in the team was expected to be Juan Manuel Fangio, the 39-year-old Argentinian, formerly a long-distance racer back in South America. He had won 8 Grand Prix over the last 2 years since arriving in Europe, including 3 wins in 1950, during which he narrowly missed out on the championship at the final race to Farina. He was nicknamed El Chueco, or the bandy-legged one, due to his football skills in his youth. Due to the retirement of the older Luigi Fagioli, Alfa Romeo had a new third driver for 1951, Consalvo Sanisi, a 40-year-old Italian who had previously been their test driver and unusually actually preferred that role. However, as Fagioli would only appear once in 1950, Sanisi was more or less forced into the race seat for 1951. Alfa Romeo's major opponent towards the end of 1950 and throughout 1951 would be the Scuderia Ferrari, formerly Alfa Romeo's factory team before the war, independent since the war, and now the closest rival to Alfa Romeo. In 1950, they had managed to pick up 3 podiums, and in 1951, their new car, developed towards the end of 1950, was fully ready to go. The Ferrari 375 F1, with a 4.5-liter naturally aspirated V12 producing 335 horsepower, and using Pirelli tires. Ferrari were quite a bit down on power on Alfa Romeo, but they did have much better fuel efficiency. The Ferrari team was also mostly unchanged from 1950, with the lead drivers being Luigi Villarizi and Alberto Ascari. Since 1950, they had, well, unfortunately, their former third driver, Raymond Solmer, had first quit Ferrari and then been killed towards the end of the previous season. For this season, they had settled on Piero Taruffi as their permanent third driver. Villarizi was a 42-year-old Italian who had previously driven for Maserati. His brother had died testing the Alfetta before the war. He had broken a leg towards the end of 1950 and missed the end of the season, and had ended up scoring 0 points in that season, despite having often better pace than Ascari due to horrific reliability problems. Ascari was the youngest out of the top drivers at the time, a 32-year-old Italian. His father had died racing in the 1920s. Ascari himself had then made the very safe choice to start off in motorcycle racing before transitioning into Formula One. A business partner of Villarizi, he had managed 2 podiums and 11 points in 1950 for 5th overall, and thus made himself the best, well, the closest thing to a challenger that Alfa Romeo had in that year, along with Louis Rosier, but we'll get to him later. Piero Taruffi was a 44-year-old Italian who had also been a motorcycle racer. He would win the 1951 Carrera Panamericana during the middle of this season. As a reminder, a lot of drivers took part in all sorts of different racing series while also racing in Formula One at this time. Taruffi had previously made 1 appearance for Alfa Romeo at, I think, the Swiss... No, at the final Italian Grand Prix of the season, sorry. But he was with Ferrari now. The closest rival to the Italian teams in 1950 had been Automobile's Talbot Lago. During the course of 1950, they had managed to pick up 2 podiums and make themselves the 3rd strongest team overall. A pre-war sports manufacturer from France, they were financially struggling in the post-war era and were mostly used by privateers. By 1951, they were actually entirely used by privateers, with the works team more or less collapsing. However, they were still, on paper, the leading non-Italian team in Formula One, with the Talbot Lago T26C, a 4.5-liter naturally aspirated straight 6 producing 260 horsepower, running Dunlop tires. They brought no updates for 1951, and the car would prove increasingly obsolete compared to the upgraded Ferrari and Alfa Romeo cars. Their lineup was essentially the same as the previous year, consisting mostly of, even for the time, aging French privateers. Louis Rosier, a 45-year-old Renault dealership owner who had would help build the Charade, was at this time, I think, helping build the Charade circuit. He drove for his own Ascari-Rosier team. In 1950, he had ended up best of the rest behind the Alphas after taking 2 podiums and 11 points for 4th overall. And we have Yves Giraud Cabantus, a 46-year-old French mechanic engineer who had won races in his own car he had built himself back in the 1930s. After starting racing in 1925, he had taken 3 points in 1950. And the oldest of these 3, Philippe Étincellin, a 54-year-old Frenchman who had driven Bugattis, Maseratis, and Talbots in the 20s, 30s. After buying a Bugatti for pleasure driving following the birth of his first child, he was already, I believe, the oldest points scorer ever in Formula One after picking up 3 points in 1950. And yeah, he was the oldest points scorer ever as a result of picking up 3 points in 1950. They did have a growing rival from France for 1951 in the form of Equipe Gordini, a French sports car manufacturer associated with Simca, the French associate of Fiat at the time. Founded after the war, a very new company. However, the whole Simca-Gordini relationship was starting to break down by 1951. They had taken 3 points in 1950, but by 51, the Simca-Gordini T15 had gotten... well, it was not fundamentally changed from 1950, but it had gotten a few upgrades under the hood, it seems. They definitely showed superior pace for 51. with the 1.5-liter supercharged flat 4 and Engelbert tires. Their major drivers were both pretty young for the time. Robert Manzone, a 34-year-old Frenchman who had started as a mechanic and was one of the few who had started racing after the war. One of the original drivers signed to the Gordini team in 1948. He would end up being the longest-lived driver from the 1951 season as he died in 2015. He had taken 3 points for Gordini in 1950. His partner was the 33-year-old Maurice Trintignant, also of France. He had started racing just before the war, but had his career interrupted by the war. He earned the unfortunate nickname Le Pétulé, or the mouse droppings man, due to an incident where his car's, I think his air filter was jammed by the aforementioned droppings in the first race after the war, after he stored it in a barn throughout the war. There were also various other teams running around the Formula One paddock at the time. Maserati had been a top rival of Alfa Romeo for most of the post-war era, very successful from 46 to 49, but in 1950 they had barely managed to scrape 1 podium and 7 points with their 4CLT 48, finishing behind Talbot and Ferrari and Alfa Romeo. Their car was a development of a Voiturette that had been designed to race the Alfa 158 in 1939, but their 1.5-liter supercharged flat 4 had long since reached its limits, and they were really running on they were slow. They were had no ability to really further develop the car for 1951, and in the background were maybe working on something else already, but they were in dire need of a new design to be competitive at all. More ambitious, perhaps, was BRM, British Racing Motors, a project of the combined British motor industry with government backing, using a lot of former personnel from the now defunct, or whether it was defunct yet or just collapsing, I'm not sure, but from the English Racing Automobiles, well-backed but quite unwieldy. The BRM P15, the result of their project, had a massive 1.5-liter supercharged V16, producing 600 horsepower, running on Dunlop tires. It was a massively powerful car, easily, that's 175 more horsepower than Alfa Romeo or something. Massively powerful for the time, but complicated and extremely unreliable. The team was seriously struggling to get the car to work at all as 1951 began. There were various other drivers running around as well. Felice Bonetto, a 47-year-old Italian pre-war road racer, nicknamed Il Pirata, the pirate, obviously. He was without a drive at the start of the season after being... he had driven for Maserati mostly in the previous year, but the effective collapse of the Maserati team left him with nothing really to do. However, midway through the season, he would end up being signed by Alfa Romeo. We'll get to that later. Reg Parnell, a 38-year-old Brit, was Britain's most successful post-war driver. He had taken wins in an ERA and a privateer Maserati, and had taken 1/3 place in 1950 after being given an Alfa Romeo guest drive at the British Grand Prix. Parnell was the lead driver for the BRM project. Berentulo de Graffenried, a 37-year-old Swiss gentleman driver, the owner of a Rolls-Royce Ferrari dealership in Switzerland. He would end up being signed by Alfa Romeo for his home race. Louis Chiron, a 51-year-old Monegasque driver who had previously been a chauffeur for the French military brass in World War I. He had originally retired in 1938, but his health had improved during the war, and he chose to return to racing after it. He remains the only native winner of the Monaco Grand Prix. And in 1951, he found himself driving a Talbot with Louis Rosier's own team. He had taken 1 podium in 1950. At the Monaco Grand Prix? Yes, at his home Grand Prix. Also, we have Luigi Fagioli, the 52-year-old Italian, 25-year veteran of Grand Prix racing. His rheumatism had more or less forced him to retire after 1950, but he would make one guest appearance in 1951 for his old Alfa Romeo team. He had previously driven for the likes of Maserati, Mercedes, and Auto Union back in the 1930s, but he had definitely lost some pace since then. In stark contrast, we have Jose Froilan Gonzalez, a 28-year-old Argentinian, the youngest driver in the field, the protege and Argentine teammate of Fangio. He started the season driving a privateer Talbot, but would end up being looked at by the top teams. He was nicknamed the Pompous Bull, or less flatteringly El Cabazon, fathead, bobblehead even. From the picture, one has to admit he doesn't exactly have the physique one expects of the modern F1 driver. Now, this is primarily covering the World Championship Grand Prix. However, I do feel we should give a mention to the non-championship Grand Prix, as they were quite important in this era. The season got started with the Gran Premio, the Syracuse Grand Prix in Italy on the 11th of March, Syracuse, Sicily, that is. Ferrari did turn up, although Alfa Romeo didn't, with Ascari taking pole. Farina was second on the grid in a privateer Maserati, as the Alfa Romeo drivers often did because Alfa didn't have the budget to attend all these small races. Then Villarizi and Dorino Serafini in another Ferrari. A total of 12 starters on the road circuit in Sicily. The result would be a 1-2 for Ferrari, thanks to Villarizi and Serafini, plus third went to Rudi Fischer in a privateer Ferrari. Then Henry Louveau in a Talbot, and Rosier also in his Talbot. They were actually the only 5 to finish the race at the 12 starters. The season ticked right on to the Pau Grand Prix in southern France, which, again, only Ferrari showed up, along with various Talbots, Gordinis, and Maseratis. Ascari, Villarizi, and Serafini locked out the front 3 spots. This was a sort of a mid-city street circuit, and then along the rivers running through the town. In the end, Villarizi did win the race ahead of Rosier, and then Farina, after 2 of the Ferraris retired. Giraud Cabantus and Etan Celine both placed for Talbot as well. On the same day, actually, which was a thing that happened not even that infrequently at this time, was the Richmond Trophy at Goodwood in Great Britain. Graham Whitehead, driving an ERA, had pole ahead of another ERA. The Thai Prince Bira in his Maserati, Parnell in a Maserati, and Duncan Hamilton in an ERA, 10 starters in total. 6 of them British cars, plus 3 Maseratis and a Talbot. The winner ultimately would be Prince Bira in his Maserati over Brian Shaw Taylor and Duncan Hamilton in their ERAs. This was a more minor race, just due to who showed up, than the Pau Grand Prix in France. Nearly a month later would be the San Remo Grand Prix in Italy. Again, Ferrari showed up and proceeded to take a 1-2 in qualifying. Serafini was 4th as the Swiss driver de Graffenried managed to split them in his Maserati. There was a pretty good turnout of Ferraris, Talbots, Maseratis, and the British HWMs. In the actual race, Ascari and Serafini took another Ferrari 1-2 with Fischer 3rd in his privateer Ferrari, then the American Harry Schell in his Maserati, and Sterling Moss in a Formula 2 HWM, taking 5th, albeit 5 laps behind the Ferraris. The pre-season racing continued with the Bordeaux Grand Prix in France, and Ferrari didn't make an official appearance here, which left things open mostly for French contenders. Louis Rosier taking pole for Talbot over Trintignant for Gordini, and then Schell in his privateer Maserati. along with Fischer in his privateer Ferrari. Whitehead, this is Peter Whitehead, also driving his privateer Ferrari, last year's model. The result would be a win for Louis Rosier over Fischer's privateer Ferrari, Whitehead's privateer Ferrari, Prince Bira in his Maserati, and then Trintignant in his Gordini, as Talbot, at least in Rosier's hands, looked to still have an advantage over Gordini in the race for best French manufacturer. The first race of the season that both Alfa Romeo and Ferrari actually showed up to was the 1951 BRDC International Trophy at the Silverstone Circuit on May 5th. Farina, well, it was run as 2 separate heats of 15 laps, followed by a final race, which was apparently only 6 laps. Ultimately, as expected, Farina, Sanisi, and Fangio all made it through the heats. However, they all had disasters in the actual race, and in the end, the winner was actually Reg Parnell in a Ferrari 375 that he had gotten from somewhere. I'm not even sure, to be honest, if it was a factory Ferrari or if it had been purchased from Ferrari by somebody, but Reg Parnell upheld British honour to win from Duncan Hamilton in a Talbot and Graham Whitehead in an ERA, all 3 British drivers. Then Fangio in his Alfa, and then Rosier in his Talbot. The race was stopped after 6 laps because of extremely torrential rain, which was the cause of Farina and Sanisi's undoing, and Fangio dropping out of the podium. Preseason kept right on ticking with the 1951 Grand Prix de Paris, where pole was taken by de Graffenried in his Maserati over Farina and a privateer Maserati at Tonsalin, and then 3 Gordinis for Simon Manzone and Fangio. I have no idea why Fangio was driving a Gordini here, but apparently he was. Fangio was not a man afraid to switch cars if he thought something was faster, so he really may have just been trying it out. In any case, in a an almost entirely French race, 12 French entries plus the 2 Maseratis on the streets of Paris, which, okay, it actually is more or less the streets of Paris. It's it was held at the public park, you're going to have to forgive my French pronunciation, the Bois de Boulogne, on the western outskirts of Paris. In any case, it was Farina that won in a privateer Maserati from Jose Froilan Gonzalez in his Talbot, with Rosier, Louveau, and Atonceline following, all in Talbots as well. The Gordinis all retired, which of course was, well, the fact that a Maserati won was a bit of a slap in the face to France, given it was the Grand Prix de Paris and all. But that finally concludes our rather lengthy pre-season here, and we can get to the actual World Championship racing, with the Swiss Grand Prix at Bremgarten on May 27th, scheduled as the first event of the year. Bremgarten had been built, some of this is a little bit repeated if you saw the 1950 season video. These are all intended to be standalone, so you'll just have to bear with it. Bremgarten had been built in 1931 in a forest near Bern as a motorcycle racing track. It was all high-speed corners, very tree-lined, uneven and changing surface, a little bit like a mini Nürburgring or something. In 1950, it had been won by Farina. In 1951, some 21 entrants arrived, including no less than 4 Alfa Romeos for Farina, Fangio, Sanisi, and the local de Graffenried. 5 Ferraris for Villarizi, Ascari, Taruffi, and also the privateer Ferraris of Peter Whitehead and Rudy Fischer, plus some 7 Talbots, 2 Maseratis, 2 HWMs, and 1 Veritas, which Veritas was apparently a German company which had started by tuning BMWs and somehow had gotten the bright idea to build its own F1 car. That didn't go especially well for them, but they made an effort. Ascari did race, but was suffering from burns sustained at a recent Formula 2 race and was not at his best. As qualifying began on the 26th of May, it looked, well, Ferrari were certainly closer, but nonetheless it was a pole for Juan Manuel Fangio, 2:35.9, which was 6.2 seconds faster than the previous year's pole position, which really illustrates the speed of development at this time, ahead of Farina, and then Villarizi, the leading Ferrari. On the second row were Sanisi and de Graffenried and two more Alfa Romeos, and then the Ferraris of Taruffi, and finally Ascari 10 seconds down on Fangio's pace in qualifying. The lead not Alfa or Ferrari was Louis Rosier and his Talbot. Behind him, Whitehead and Fisher in their privateer Ferraris, which Whitehead's was actually an older Ferrari 125 from 1950, but I couldn't be bothered to get the right picture for it, so my apologies. Then the Talbots of Louveau, Etanceline, and Gonzalez, all over 20 seconds down. Sterling Moss in a Formula 2 HWM. Gerald Cabontus in his Talbot. Peter Hurt in the Veritas. Harry Schell in a privateer Maserati. Johnny Claes in a Talbot. And yeah, I miscalculated and ran out of room here. Chiron in his Maserati. George Abakasis in another Formula 2 HWM, and Guy Mares in a Talbot. As the race actually got underway, there was heavy rain and very wet conditions. Farina chose to fit extra fuel tanks in an effort to go without stopping, apparently cramming them into the cockpit and just all over the car. Sounds like an extremely unsafe sort of thing to do, which pretty much fits right in with what we generally see in 1951, so I believe it. At the actual race lead, Fangio did hold the lead from Farina, while Sanisi got by Villarici for third. Hertz's fuel feed on the Veritas failed on the grid, and he was unable to actually start. Tough luck for him. Ascari immediately made up a place from Taruffi. Here we see, this is an image of Taruffi during the Grand Prix. As you can see, it was indeed very wet. Very, very wet. As the race got going properly, Villarici was able to reclaim third, while Ascari, after getting a better start, was really struggling with the pain from his burns and quickly proved uncompetitive and waved Taruffi by for sixth. And that proved a good choice, as within a few laps, Taruffi was able to overtake de Graffenried and make his way into the points. And the Ferraris were going well for the first time, really, except carrying on from the very end of last season, perhaps. Alfa might have a 1-2, but Ferrari had the pace to actually match them as they carried on around the track. The first retirement, a little surprisingly for that time, well, other than Hurt on the grid, of course, but the first in-race retirement, a bit surprisingly for the time, wasn't until lap 11 when Gonzalez was out with an oil pump failure. Shortly thereafter, the best of Ferrari's hopes took a terrible blow, as on lap 13, Villarici aquaplaned into a hedge and was out of the Grand Prix, although fortunately unhurt. Still, Taruffi was actually holding up his end for Ferrari, as on lap 15 he overtook Sanisi to make his way onto the podium. Fangio, meanwhile, was running very well at the front, with less fuel than Farina, and had built up more than a 30-second advantage. Gerard Cabontus, meanwhile, was out with an ignition failure. Although none of the lower, with the sheer number of cars and the pace that Alfa and Ferrari were bringing this year, it took quite a miracle for another car to make it into the points. It was on lap 23, about halfway through the race, that Fangio made his sole pit stop and Farina took the lead. Meanwhile, Abakasis in his HWM retired with a magneto failure. Farina, with his pile of extra fuel tanks, was able to go right into the lead. He had no plans to stop. However, Fangio, although he was overtaken here, with the benefit of his newer tires, and he shouldn't have actually been on lower fuel at this point, but he didn't have big empty extra fuel tanks all over everything either. In any case, by lap 29, Fangio was able to retake the lead from Farina. Meanwhile, Moss and Chiron in their HWM and Maserati respectively had really been pushing their way up the midfield, although, as I mentioned, the odds of actually making it into the points for them pretty slim. Also, I don't have the exact laps they made overtakes because nobody writes down what happens with back markers, sadly. I don't have any exact lap charts for this period. On lap 31, Henry Louveau crashed badly, flipped, and was thrown clear of his car, breaking his leg. He did fortunately survive, but it was the end of the Frenchman's racing career as he elected to retire afterwards. It was actually only his second Grand Prix, and he would have been, well, he would have been 41 actually, but that's pretty standard for the time. As the race continued to carry on lap 37, Peter Whitehead and his privateer Ferrari was the next to crash out in the same place as Louveau, emerging with only cuts and bruises due to chance. Farina, meanwhile, was really struggling with his handling as his fuel tanks began to run empty. The extra ones, that is. And Taruffi began to catch up to him quite rapidly. On lap 41, Taruffi was able to pass Farina for second, although Fangio was well ahead. Fangio would win the race by nearly a minute with the fastest lap at 2:51.1. Sterling Moss ran out of fuel on his run to the finish line and ended up being passed by Louis Chiron for 7th while he was busy pushing his car the last 100 meters across the finish line. So, in the end, it was a comfortable victory in the first race of the season for Juan Manuel Fangio of Alfa Romeo. 2:07:53.64, 55 seconds ahead of Piero Taruffi, a minute 19 ahead of his teammate and last season's championship rival Nino Farina. Sanisi finished a lap down in another Alfa Romeo, and Baron de Graffenried 2 laps down in a 4th Alfa Romeo. In the end, with Ascari suffering from his burns, although Ferrari showed a lot of pace and Taruffi was able to take them to second, it was still a 1:3.54 for Alfa Romeo, and only a 2:6 for Ferrari. Other cars running included, Ascari, who finished 2 laps down, along with Chiron and Moss. 3 laps down, Rosier and Atonceline and the Talbots. Also, Fischer and his privateer Ferrari sports car. 4 laps down, Shell. 7 laps, Claes, and Guimarães finished 11 laps down for some reason. I have no idea why, but I don't think he was generally that slow, so he must have had mechanical issues. But Johnny Claes generally was that slow. That's all just him. So, after one round of the championship, Fangio, of course, led over Taruffi, Farina, Sanisi, and de Graffenried. I'm keeping track of an unofficial Constructors' Championship. None actually existed yet in 1951, but the system I'm using is the same as the one that would be used when they created the first Constructors' Championship, which is that only the top scoring car from your team counts, and only the best 4 out of 8 races count, same as in the Drivers' Championship. That was necessary because the number of cars fielded by a manufacturer was totally randomly variable at the time. Technically speaking, the second race of the 1951 Formula One's World Champ of the 1951 Drivers' World Championship was the Indianapolis 500 on May 30th. 33 cars started. Lee Wallard won from 5th. He finished the race with no brakes, a damaged exhaust, a broken shock absorber, and an experimental fireproof suit that chafed so badly that he had to have medical attention before he went onto the podium. And 1 week later, he was terribly burned in a crash and retired, so this would be the last success of Wallard's career. Nonetheless, well, it's a very 1951 victory, and a very outstanding one. He was ahead of Mike Nazaruk, Jack McGrath, and Manny Aiello sharing the third-place car, Andy Linden and Bobby Ball. I mention all this because, of course, they did score World Championship points, albeit they wouldn't compete in Europe, so they wouldn't score any more. There would be just one more non-championship race between Switzerland and Belgium, which was the Ulster Trophy in Ireland, Northern Ireland. Farina took pole in his private... was he in the privateer Maserati? Just a second. No, Farina, for whatever reason, got the funding to bring his actual Alfa Romeo and took pole in that, ahead of Parnell, who was driving that Ferrari 375 that was... I believe it was bought for him by Guy Vandervelde, who would later found Van Wall. That's the story there. So, Farina took pole over Parnell in his Ferrari 375, then several British entries, de Graaf and Reed. The bulk of the field was composed of Talbots, Maseratis, and the British ERAs, but Alfa and Ferrari, of course, stole the show. In the end, Farina won by 72 seconds over Parnell. Then Shaw Taylor and Bob Gerard in their ERAs, and Giraud Cabontus in his Talbot. The third round of the Formula One World Championship was the Belgian Grand Prix at Spa-Francorchamps, held on the 17th of June. Spa, of course, was the original Spa, or post-war Spa, but only minor changes from the original, linking the three Belgian villages of Francorchamps, Malmedy, and Stavelot. The only changes made from the original public roads were mostly to increase speed and flow for racing, especially around Uroge and Radion. It was probably the fastest and most dangerous track in Europe, with hardly any braking points except at La Source. I don't remember if you had to brake for the Mas the Kink at this point or not. Probably at this point you did, but you couldn't brake for more than an instant or you would. I think maybe you just had to let off on the gas, yeah. The Mas the Kink, in any case, was legendarily dangerous because if you had to push it as hard as possible or you would lose enormous amounts of time on the straight afterwards. It had been won by Fangio the year before. Fangio brought an experimental new suspension for Alfa Romeo with a new wheel design. A lot of the privateers were distracted by the Isle of Man TT support race, which came with a big purse. So, in the end, only 13 entrants arrived in Spa, 3 Alfas, 3 Ferraris, and some 7 Talbot Lagos. Pole position went, once again, to Juan Manuel Fangio by 3 seconds over Nino Farina, and then by 4 seconds over Luigi Villarici in his Ferrari. By now, Ascari was recovering from his burns and was 5 seconds down in 4th alongside Taruffi. Behind them, Sanisi in the 3rd Alpha and the 6th of the frontrunners, no less than 9 seconds behind Sanisi. Pretty much the whole gap from Fangio to Sanisi again was Rosier and his Talbot, and then Giraud Cabontus. The other 5 Talbots being Chiron, Etanceline, and then Claes, André Pellet, a local Belgian, and Pierre Levey. As the race got underway, Fangio and Farina were both carrying heavy fuel loads and had slow starts. As a result, Villarici shot into the lead, and Ascari also made up a place, although Sanisi got a better start than Taruffi somehow. Etanceline, meanwhile, suffered an immediate transmission failure and was the first retirement of the race, which, with only 13 cars starting the race, they could not afford a lot of attrition. Farina briefly took the lead as they went around into the second lap, but Villarici quickly reclaimed it. Fangio, meanwhile, after dropping way back at the start, was able to overtake Sanisi and get back into 4th. By the third lap, Farina, with burning off fuel and his car lightening, was able to take the lead from Villarizi. And it soon became clear that Villarizi was really struggling with his handling, as Ascari was able to pass him for second. And Fangio quickly also went past Villarizi and back onto the podium. Just one lap later, on lap 6, Fangio went past Ascari, and it was back into an Alfa Romeo 1-2 with Farina and Fangio to end the chaos of the first 6 laps. As the race carried on, well, Ferrari was still running 3, 4, and 6 at that point, but things quickly began to go a little bit more wrong for them. On lap 8, Taruffi came in to retire with a transmission failure, leaving only the 5 top cars running. On lap 9, Villarizi had to pit. They identified a loose oil pipe as the cause of his problems and fixed it, but that dropped him down to 5th behind Sinisi. By lap 10, Fangio set a lap record of 4:22.1, which was 2.9 seconds faster than his pole time, and was closing up on Farina. Alfa was planning to make 2 stops during this race, and on lap 12 they started their first pit cycle, at which point something went wrong for them as Sinisi's radiator overheated and burst in the pits, not eliminating him from the race. Farina was called in the same lap, but decided to stay out. He came in 2 laps later and proceeded to have a long stop, which lasted nearly a minute. I believe about 30 to 35 seconds was considered good at the time, because they were fueling, of course. That let Fangio buy into the lead and guaranteed that the Talbots, well, that didn't do anything, but Sinisi's retirement guaranteed that the Talbots would get at least 1 point. 2 points, in fact, given the system at the time. 1 lap after Farina, Fangio made his pit stop, and the new experimental wheels jammed in place and could not be removed. Fangio tragically sat unmoving in the pit lane for 14.5 minutes, emerging last and knowing that he couldn't change tires again for any reason. On lap 16, just a lap later, while Fangio was sitting in the pits, Ascari made his only stop, which went well, and Villarizi would make his a few laps later. At this point, Farina was the only real Alfa Romeo hope ahead of Ascari and Villarizi. However, as it turned out, that would pretty much work out. On lap 25, Farina made his second pit stop, and this time it was quick and routine, and he was able to keep the lead over the Ferraris on his sheer pace. And from there, nothing of extreme interest happened in the race. On lap 29, Chiron retired from 6th with engine failure. He wasn't likely to get points anyway. In the end, Farina was able to hold on to win by nearly 3 minutes from Ascari and then Villarizi. Fangio finished 9th, but did have the fastest lap with that lap record for a point. Still, this ended any chance of him running away with the championship, and put Ascari and Villarizi on the board for Ferrari. Rosier and Gerald Cabantus finished 2 laps down on the Alfa and then 2 Ferraris, and Talbot thus actually got a double points finish thanks to the unreliability of the Alfas and Ferraris. Other finishers being Pilet and Claes 3 laps down, Levey and Fangio 4 laps down. So after 3 rounds of the championship, 2 European rounds, but nevertheless, Nino Farina was the championship leader with 12 points, courtesy of a win in Belgium and 3rd in Switzerland. Fangio had 10, given his win with fastest lap and then just a fastest lap. Ascari and Taruffi had 6 apiece, Villarizi 4. Sinisi and Rosier were both at 3, and of course various others had points as well. But the obvious protagonists appeared to be Farina and Fangio, although Ferrari had much more pace than the previous year, but they needed one man to put it together consistently for them rather than splitting points. As for the constructors, Alfa are of course the leaders there with 2 straight wins over Ferrari, and Talbot the only other manufacturer to score after 2 races. Next, we have the French Grand Prix at Reims Go on the 1st of July. Reims, this track is unpronounceable for me personally, but someone might know how to pronounce it right. Someone French, preferably. First used in 1926, it was basically just a triangle of public roads with a bit of increased width and speed. A similar concept to Spa, but it was not as long or as dangerous. It had very few trees around it, so going off was not necessarily a death sentence. The last winner was Fangio the previous year. Alfa did choose to bring a 4th car to France for Fagioli to drive as he made a return. And Ferrari, Taruffi fell sick before the race, and Ferrari decided to give the promising pompous bull, or bobblehead, Jose Froilan Gonzalez, a drive for the race. So, all told, 23 cars would show up, which would be 4 Alfas, 5 Ferraris, the 3 works cars, plus 2 privateers, 7 Talbots, 4 Gordinis, and 3 Maseratis. Fangio would take his 3rd pole running for the season, over Farina once again. Ascari was now able to get himself onto the front row, just 2.4 seconds back, and was pretty much healed from those burns, I would say. On the 2nd row, Villarici and Sanisi, Ferrari and Alfa. And then Gonzalez in his Ferrari, Fagioli in his Alfa, and Louis Chiron, the leading Talbot, and non-Alfa / Ferrari. Behind him, Parnell, who had a Ferrari 375, albeit a non-works one, and wasn't doing much with it. And then Etanceline. Behind them, Gerald Cabantus, Claes, and Rosier in a row of Talbots. Eugene Chabud in a Talbot, and Onofre Maramon of Argentina in a Maserati, powered by a Milano engine, which was still an ongoing experiment after not having much success last year. Then de Graffenried in a Maserati, and then Gordini entered a strong team, and the lead car for them would end up being Aldo Gordini's, Aldo being the son of the Gordini founder, Amade Gordini. Funnily enough, one would think that's a pure nepotism appointment, but Aldo out-qualified the other 3 Gordini drivers here, beating Trintignant by a 10th. Then Mares in his Talbot, Whitehead in his privateer Ferrari, Simon in his Gordini, Shell in a Maserati, and Manzone in another Gordini. As the race got underway on the 1st of July, Fangio got away in the lead, but Farina had serious wheel spin and immediately lost 4 places. Now, it was hot again, maybe not quite as hot as the previous year when there had been horrific engine and heating-related retirement, but still a hot French midsummer. And almost immediately, Whitehead and de Graffenried were both out with engine problem. Well, de Graffenried had a transmission problem. Whitehead had an engine problem. And, I should say, Ascari immediately took the lead from Fangio by the end of the first lap, drafting by on the massive straights of Reims, but critically, he looked able to actually hold the lead, as the Alphas were significantly weighed down by fuel. So for the moment, Ascari's lead was pretty stable. On the following laps, Maramon was out with an engine failure. Manzone was out with an engine failure. About lap 5, Sanisi, running in 4th, developed a misfire and proceeded to drop behind the other front runners, Gonzalez and Farina, immediately. Meanwhile, Ascari and Villarici continued to sandwich Fangio, who was unable to make his way back into the lead despite his horsepower, which really should have counted for a lot here. By lap 8, Simon was out next with also an engine failure. Meanwhile, Farina was able to go by Gonzalez and started catching up to the top 3. On lap 9, Ferrari's bright hope for the day died a horrible death as Ascari's gearbox seized up. Fangio went right by into the lead, and Ascari was out of the race, leaving Villarizi as the leading Ferrari hope. And just a lap later, Farina went by Villarizi, only for Fangio to himself begin misfiring and come into the pits for repairs. Thus Farina, as he passed Villarizi, promptly found himself in the race lead for the second time running, benefiting from Fangio's reliability misfortune. As Fangio dropped right to the back, hoping to get some sort of repairs done, other cars began going out. Trintignant retired with an engine failure on lap 12. Meanwhile, Fagioli was able to pass Gonzalez for third and was running quite well despite his rheumatism and age. As Alfa were entirely unable to fix Fangio's car on lap 20, when Fagioli came in for his first scheduled fuel stop, he was ordered to give his car to Fangio, something that was only possible in the early 50s, and controversial even then. Fagioli agreed and gave his car to Fangio, but was absolutely furious about it, and he would declare his retirement from Formula One racing, or Grand Prix racing, immediately after the race for good. Farina, meanwhile, had a good stop from the lead and kept the lead. Sanisi was still misfiring very badly and was dropping back down the order, with Talbot's actually overtaking him. Fagioli would not be completely out of the race, as Fangio's car finally was able to be fitted with a completely new magneto and got started again, albeit about 20 laps down on the field, but apparently Fagioli was angry enough that nobody told him there was not much point in going out again. So that left, as the mess cleared up, Farina leading from Villarizi, Gonzalez, and then the car shared, well, the car that was now driven by Fangio, formerly Fagioli's. As the laps continued to tick on, Shell was the next out with overheating problems. On lap 25, Gonzalez came in from second for his fuel stop. Ferrari were planning 2 to Alfa's 3. And Ferrari decided to go ahead and imitate Alfa Romeo and ordered Gonzalez, the rookie after all, to hand his car over to Ascari so that he could set off in pursuit of Fangio. Thus we find Fangio running third, Ascari running fourth, and neither of them in their original car by the 1/3 mark of the French Grand Prix, chasing their teammates Farina and Villarizi. Meanwhile, Gordini is the next to go out with an engine failure on lap 28. As we approach the halfway point of the race, by lap 32, Fangio sets the fastest lap and is able to pass Villarizi for second, closing in quickly on Farina. However, he is burning a ton of fuel in the process, and apparently no one told him to save fuel, so on lap 36 he had to make a second pit stop a bit early and dropped right back to fourth, behind both of the chasing Ferraris. Meanwhile, Tansanin was out with an engine failure, while Ascari proceeded to pass Villarizi and made his way into second. On lap 44, Farina, running very comfortably in the lead, as you might expect after all this, suffered a sudden and unexpected tire blowout and limped back to the pits, overshot his marks, had a very long pit stop, and finally came out in fifth. Meanwhile, back in the pack, Rosier retired with a broken transmission, and Fangio, somewhere in the process of this, also passed Villarizi and found himself in second, so at the 2/3 mark, by this point of the French Grand Prix, Ascari was leading from Fangio, neither one in their original car still, and the battle was very much on, until, on lap 50, Ascari began suffering brake problems, a second car of the day braking for him, and had to make a pit stop. Fangio went into the lead and began lapping very quickly, as he worked to build up a pit stop advantage, knowing that he had to stop once more still. On lap 55, Claes was out with a big crash, but was fortunately unhurt. On lap 60, Fangio came in for his third and final stop of the race and came out still leading after a quick 35-second stop. And finally, after 77 laps, Juan Manuel Fangio, in the car that Fagioli had started, won the race by 58.2 seconds from Alberto Ascari in the car that Gonzalez had started. Villarici in the Works Ferrari and Parnell in the Privateer Ferrari took third and fourth, with Farina ultimately fifth in the other Alfa Romeo. Sanisi and Fagioli's Alfas both technically finished the race, but 10th and 11th after their assorted crippling issues, and way behind. It was a bit of opposite outcomes for the two drivers who were substituted out of their own cars. As I mentioned before, Fagioli was absolutely furious and declared his retirement from Grand Prix racing on the spot. Gonzalez, on the other hand, was worried that he had not impressed Ferrari and was being fired, but was then, by the end of the race, offered a contract for the rest of the season by Enzo Ferrari, who had in fact been very impressed. And, not least perhaps, with his willingness to take orders. In any case, the shared Fagioli-Fangio car won from Gonzalez and Ascari. Villarici finished 3 laps down, but still third in his Ferrari. And this after the swaps and all the trouble these cars had. Ascari and Fangio were fast, to say the least. 4 laps down, Parnell in his Privateer Ferrari, and also Farina in his Alfa after his unexpected brake damage. Other finishers, Chiron and Gerald Cabontus, 6 laps down in their Talbots. Chaboud, 8 laps down in his Talbot. Guy Mares, 11 laps down in his Talbot. Sanisi and the Fangio started. Fagioli finished Alfa 19 and 22 laps down, respectively. Only 11 out of the 23 starters actually finished the race. This bit of madness, with the split points and all, left Fangio leading the championship by 1 point over Farina. Fangio effectively scored 5 points for the race to Farina's 2. What happened when drivers shared a car was that points were evenly split between them. Fagioli and Fangio would get 4 each. Fangio also set fastest lap while he was in the car, and he got full credit for the fastest lap points, so 5. Gonzalez and Ascari got 3 each. So Fangio led by a point from Farina, and then Ascari had 9. Villarici with 8 from 2/3 was pretty much right there as well for Ferrari. Then Taruffi, Fagioli and Gonzalez with their shared drive points, and Parnell, Sanisi, Rosier, etc. In the unofficial constructors, that's 3 wins in a row for Alfa, and they have a pretty significant advantage over Ferrari. Although, this is much more competitive than last year when Alfa pretty much won every race easily. Despite the fact that they've won all 3 races of the early season here, Ferrari has made it tough for them on every occasion, and it's Ferrari's own reliability that's letting them down to some extent, albeit Alfa has not exactly had perfect reliability either. The 5th round of the 1951 Formula One season would be the British Grand Prix at Silverstone on the 14th of July. The Silverstone Circuit was a surplus RAF airfield that had been taken over by the Royal Automobile Club in 1948. Still in that same configuration as the previous year. It was a fast track. It had few real corners. In 1950, it had been won by Farina as the inaugural Formula One World Championship race. With Fagioli announcing his retirement permanently after the French Grand Prix, The pirate Felice Bonetto was signed by Alfa Romeo to replace him in their fourth car. Attendance at the circuit was pretty low as there was a lack of competitive British cars. 20 cars showed up, being 4 Alfas, 4 Ferraris, 3 factory cars, plus Peter Whitehead in the dark blue Van der Velde Ferrari, 4 Talbots, 3 Maseratis, 3 ERAs, 1 Alta, and the 2 BRM P15s of British Racing Motors finally showed up for the first time, with Parnell and Peter Walker at the wheel. In qualifying, although they barely showed up in time and were unable to actually qualify. In any case, in qualifying, Gonzalez beat Fangio to pole position by a second, 7.4 seconds faster than the previous year's pole. And for the first time in the entire history of the Formula One World Championship, with the exception of the Indy 500, Alfa Romeo did not take pole. Fangio was only second, then Farina and Ascari, all on the front row. The second row, Villarici, Sanisi, and Bonetto in the other works Italian entries. The third row had Whitehead in his non-works Ferrari, then Rosier in the lead Talbot, Gerard in his ERA, and Duncan Hamilton in another Talbot. Then Shaw Taylor, Chiron, and Clays in their ERA and then Talbots. David Murray, Philip Fotheringham Parker, and John James in an assortment of Maseratis, Joe Kelly in an Alta, and starting at the very back would be Peter Walker and Reg Parnell in their BRMs. As the race got going, Bonetto had a brilliant start out of 7th. Granted, that was only the second row with the wide grid, but had a brilliant start and shot into the lead. Fangio dropped 3 places into 5th by Woodcote, and meanwhile the BRMs started from the back but immediately found themselves easily powering past the Maseratis and Talbots on the straights with massively superior power. Although Bonetto had a brilliant start, by lap 2 Gonzalez was able to go into the lead past him as he didn't have the pace to actually hold that advantage. And as a few laps went on, Fangio proved to have the pace, and on lap 4 overtook both Ascari and Farina to go back into 3rd, behind only Gonzalez and Bonetto, who was falling back. By lap 5, Fangio was past Bonetta as well, and Bonetto as well, and Farina and Ascari quickly followed. Separate battles began to develop between Gonzalez and Fangio for the lead, and then Farina and Ascari for 3rd. As they continued to lap around the track, on lap 10, Fangio was able to take the lead, but Gonzalez stuck close behind him as they battled their way around Silverstone. Fangio was still carrying a heavier fuel load at this point, I would say, but was planning an extra pit stop compared to the Ferraris, as usual. Meanwhile, Walker and Parnell were making their way pretty rapidly through the field in the BRMs. On lap 15, Villarici spun while trying to pass Bonetto at Copse and lost out to Sanisi, who took over 7th. Meanwhile, Whitehead in his privateer Ferrari was unable to even keep ahead of Parnell. However, the BRMs, by the time they made their way up to 8th and 10th respectively, were not quite fast enough and far enough behind that they weren't able to make any real impression on the leading works Italian cars. The race carried on with John James, the first retirement, on lap 24 with a burst radiator. Meanwhile, after initially getting a little bit distanced, their lighter cars and better handling were allowing the Ferraris to pull up towards the first pit stop phase. And finally, on lap 39, Gonzalez retook the lead from Fangio, even as Sanisi and Villarici both finally cleared Bonetto. Meanwhile, Farina set the fastest lap of the race, a 1:44.0, and was successfully holding off Ascari in the battle for 3rd. Retirements proceeded to take place as Chiron was out with a brake failure on lap 42. Then a few laps later, Fotheringham, Parker with an oil leak, and Murray with an engine failure as back markers began to inevitably drop out. Both Ferrari and Alfa Romeo had actually finally decided to go with one fuel stop, and Gonzalez took his on lap 48. It took 23 seconds. Ascari was also coming in, and he offered the car to Ascari as the lead Ferrari driver had gearbox problems, but Ascari declined, and Gonzalez went back out in second. Just a lap later, Fangio made his fuel stop, followed quickly by the other Alfas. Fangio's stop was over 45 seconds, and Gonzalez easily went back ahead of him. Plus, Ascari jumped Farina for third when Farina made his stop immediately after. It was even worse for Sinisi, who had a jammed wheel, the same as Fangio's problem in Belgium, and dropped way towards the back. Plus, Peter Whitehead and his privateer Ferrari had a brake problem, way overshot his pit box, and dropped well back as well. So, coming out of the main pit stop phase, Gonzalez had actually a pretty decent lead over Fangio and a much lighter fuel load with which to pull away initially, at least until the Alfa could burn off some of that fuel. Plus, Ascari was ahead of Farina, and Villarizi was up to fifth. Unfortunately, Ascari did have the gearbox problems I mentioned, and on lap 56, it failed entirely, leading to him retiring from third. Fortunately for Fangio and Gonzalez, unfortunately for him, but fortunately for Ascari, 20 laps later, as the race crawled on towards its end, Farina also retired with a clutch failure which caught fire. Thus, one of Fangio's closest championship rival wouldn't actually finish the race. His closest two wouldn't finish the race. But he was not able to catch up to Jose Froilán González, and the pompous bull took Ferrari's first Formula One win by 51 seconds after 90 laps around Silverstone, ahead of Juan Manuel Fangio, Luigi Villarizi, Faris Bonetto, and, with the retirements and problems, Reg Parnell, although 5 laps down, was able to take points for BRM, although the exhaust was badly placed and was burning Parnell's legs as he drove. So Villarizi was third, 2 laps down. Bonetto 3 laps down, but nonetheless grabbed points for Alfa, maybe less than he would have wanted after his electric start. And then Parnell 5 laps down. Other finishers, Sinisi and his Alfa ended up 6 laps down after his wheel jam problem, as did Walker in the other BRM, not as fast as Parnell. Shaw Taylor in the ERA. Peter Whitehead in the privateer Ferrari, 7 laps down, along with Rosier. 8 laps Gerard, 9 Hamilton, and 10 laps down Johnny Claes in the Talbot. That second place meant that since Farina only got 1 point for fastest lap, and Ascari retired completely, Fangio actually extended his championship lead with 21 points to Farina's 15. Villarizi had 3 thirds in a row, and that consistency took him into third in the championship with 12. Meanwhile, the outright win for Gonzalez brought him immediately into contention with 11, ahead of Ascari in the championship. Ascari's reliability problems thus far and his early season injury meant he was still on only 9 points, 12 behind Fangio with the season more than half over now. And it was looking pretty grim for the Ferrari challenge as a whole. But we have to set that aside and say that Ferrari defeated Alfa Romeo for the first time to finally win in Formula One after 9 straight defeats. Ferrari was the first team other than Alfa Romeo to win an actual Formula One World Championship race if we exclude the Indianapolis 500. Other than those two, no one is really scoring points, with Talbot struggling and BRM successful here, but still with major reliability troubles, and they had to make a tremendous effort just to get the cars to run for their home race, let alone overseas races. Ahead of the next race, there would be a couple of non-championship races. The Scottish Grand Prix would see no more than 10 cars show up, of which only 4 were actually Formula One cars. It was held at the Winfield Airfield circuit on the 21st of July. Philip Fotheringham Parker and his Maserati won ahead of a BMW and Jaguar sports car. Then the Dutch Grand Prix on the 23rd of July, which did see a strong attendance with Farina appearing in his privateer Maserati, plus Chiron and Pillet in their Talbots, Etanceline and Claes also in Talbots. One Ferrari did appear in the form of a privateer, in the form of Rudy Fischer's privateer Ferrari 212 sports car. The final result would be a win for Louis Rosier, despite starting pretty far back on the grid, over Etanceline, Sterling Moss in a Formula 2 HWM, Fischer in his privateer Ferrari, and Duncan Hamilton in his Talbot after Farina retired, as did Chiron and Claes. And that brings us to the German Grand Prix on the 29th of July, arguably the last race of the sort of core busy part of the season, which had seen 3 races in a month. It would be another month and a half until the Italian Grand Prix afterwards. But for now, Formula One paid its first visit to the Nürburgring. Built in 1927 as Germany's premier purpose-built racetrack, although you would hardly even know it was intended as a racetrack. Winding, mountainous, often rainy, but often not rainy on the whole track at once. Extremely long at 22.835 kilometers, or 14.189 miles. It would later be nicknamed the Green Hell by Jackie Stewart. Formula One ran 20 laps of this terrifying racetrack. Alfa Romeo and Ferrari each brought 4 cars. Sinisi had elected to resign and return to a test driver seat, and so the local Paul Pietsch of Germany was brought in to replace him. Meanwhile, Taruffi returned from injury for Ferrari, so the 4-car lineups would be Ascari, Villarici, Taruffi, and Gonzalez for Ferrari, Fangio, Farina, Bonetto, and Pietsch for Alfa Romeo. Besides that, there would be the privateer Ferrari of Fischer, plus some 8 Talbots, 3 Maseratis, and the 3 Gordinis. In qualifying on the 28th, Ascari took pole by 1.7 seconds over Gonzalez with a 9:55.8 lap time around the Nürburgring. Then Fangio and Farina completing the front row, but once again beaten on raw pace. In a real, well, for the second time in a row, and the first 2 times they had ever been beaten in such a fashion. On the second row, Villarici, Taruffi, and then Pietsch in the 3rd Alfa. Rudy Fischer in his privateer Ferrari was 28 seconds back on the 3rd row. Then Robert Manzone in the lead Gordini. Felice Bonetto, the Pirate, was 50.3 seconds off the pace in his Alfa Romeo and would start only 10th. I'm not quite sure what his reasoning was, but that's where he qualified. Then Gerard Cabontus in his Talbot. Behind them, Simone and a Gordini, Chiron and a Talbot, and Trintignant in the 3rd Gordini. Then Rosier in his Talbot, De Graffenried and Tony Branca, both Swiss drivers, in their Maseratis. And Johnny Claes in his Talbot. And behind them, Levey, Hamilton, and Etanceline in their Talbots. And on the very last row, Jack Swatters of Belgium in his Talbot, and David Murray of England in a Maserati. That said, Murray had a terrible accident in practice, wasn't able to actually set a qualifying time, and wouldn't take the race start either. He was alright, though. At the start of the race, the Alphas with their superior power got better starts, and Farina went into the lead from Fangio, then Ascari and Gonzalez. Pietsch also jumped Villarici and Taruffi. However, Farina's good start didn't last, as within the lap he dropped back behind first Fangio, then also Ascari and Gonzalez. However, Fangio was able to hold the lead on pace through the first lap, with Ascari building himself into a clear second. Gonzalez and Farina were then battling for third, clearly faster than Piech, Villarizi, and Taruffi. On the second lap, Piech had a spin and dropped right to the back, while de Graffenried became the first retirement of the race with an engine failure. More retirements would follow, as on lap 3 out went Branca with an ignition problem and Chiron with an engine problem, Chiron with an ignition failure. And on lap 4, Tansanin was out with a gearbox issue. By a quarter of the way through the race, Ascari was beginning to close up on the Alfa. I'm thinking that possibly the Ferraris were better with... Once the Ferraris burned off a bit of their fuel, I'm thinking they were maybe quite a bit better on handling, because that's been a bit of a trend. In any case, Ascari closed up on lap 5, and that Prix in the north of the track, he took the lead from Fangio. Taruffi, meanwhile, had to change his spark plugs and dropped well away from Villarizi, although the gap between the top 6 and everyone else was so enormous that he stayed ahead of Fischer when he did it. On lap 7, Fangio made the first of 2 planned pit stops and dropped behind Gonzalez in the process. And the next lap, Farina was out with overheating problems, as the issues really started to mount for Alfa, and it begins to look somewhat improbable that they could win this race. With Fangio now the only Alfa running properly at the front, Bonetto unable to make up ground at the back, just totally off the pace here. And now it's Ferrari 1, 2, 4, 5, 6, with Fangio struggling in third. In lap 10, the Ferraris made their one fuel stop, which was enough to allow Fangio by into the lead. However, he still had one stop himself to make. Cars continued to go out, as on lap 11, both Simon and Piech were out. The former with engine overheating, while Piech crashed into an embankment on the north side of the track. Fortunately, was unhurt. On lap 12, Hamilton and Bonetto followed, with Hamilton having an oil pressure loss, Bonetto a magneto failure. And now, not only was Fangio the only Alfa Romeo in the points, he was simply the last Alfa Romeo still running at all, with 5 Ferraris, 4 of them works cars, chasing him, and he had a pit stop to make still. He did, of course, pile on the absolute greatest speed he could, but Ascari and Gonzalez were just not that much slower than him. On lap 13, Trintignant retired with an engine failure. Not that it mattered too much, as with so many Ferraris, it looks unlikely that anybody else will make it into the points. On lap 14, Fangio made his second pit stop and dropped to second place behind Ascari, and as he pulled out of the pits, found himself missing all but third and fourth gear, leaving himself with little to no chance to catch up to Ascari. In fact, he put on a very impressive performance to stay within, not even really within touching distance, but to not lose time at a tremendous rate, given the state of his gearbox over the last few laps. A few more cars went out. On lap 17, Gerald Cabontus had a slow puncture. No, I'm sorry. Gerald Cabontus crashed and was out. Ascari developed a slow puncture, but given Fangio's gearbox problems, was able to pit and stay ahead of him. Fangio was, however, comfortably ahead of Gonzalez, despite his issues. And finally, after 20 laps, Ascari won the German Grand Prix by 30.5 seconds over Fangio, who had taken the fastest lap before developing his gearbox problem. Ferrari took a 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, if you had the non-works car, with only Fangio there to spoil the party, second with fastest lap, despite his late gearbox problem. A really impressive drive under the circumstances. And Manzone in the last Gordini standing beat all of the Talbots in a major blow for best non-Italian manufacturer. As you can see, Gonzalez ended up 4 minutes 3 and a 4 minutes, 8.5 seconds behind Fangio, despite Fangio's gearbox troubles, with Villarizi another minute back in fourth, and Taruffi another 2 minutes back from that. Other finishers, Fischer, Manzone, and Rosier a lap down, Levey and Swatters 2 laps down, and Johnny Clays managed to finish 3 laps down in his Talbots. So, Fangio's second with fastest lap made this all but a win for him, really. He scored actually 7 points to Ascari's 8. He did have to remember that only the best 4 races count at this time, so Fangio had to drop his fastest lap point from Belgium. I'm keeping it in parentheses just so we're aware of it, but it's no longer relevant, really. But with a first with fastest lap, a second with fastest lap, a second, and a shared first with fastest lap under his belt, Fangio was at 27 points. Ascari's win does keep him somewhat in contention at 17. Then Farina scoring nothing with 15. Villarizi also 15, although he now really needs podiums only in order to improve his score at all, so he's in a bad position with dropped points to consider. Gonzalez also at 15 in a much better position. Then others, Taruffi at 8, Parnell 5, Fagioli 4, and so on. In our unofficial Constructors' Championship, Alfa Romeo still has a lead over Ferrari, helped out by taking 3 fastest laps so far. But Ferrari are not entirely out of it by any means, with 2 races to go. If they could actually win both of them with fastest lap anyway. There would be a couple more non-championship Grand Prix in the significant gap before the Italian Grand Prix. Firstly, the Albi Grand Prix in, I believe this is southern France. Yes, in southern France, a very triangular sort of circuit. The event attracted 14 entries, of which 4 were Gordinis, 7 were Talbots. So mainly French interest. The Ferrari entries that showed up were both relatively minor privateers, and in the end, Trintignant won the race for Gordini ahead of Rosier and Chiron, then Simon, and then Johnny Clays and his Talbot. So those retirements are just incorrect. That's been carried over from somewhere on accident. Then the Pescara Grand Prix. On the large Pescara circuit, this was a 25-kilometer circuit in Italy. Ascari did show up to this one, along with Villarizi. As the entire Ferrari team, also Gonzalez. And, I don't think Taruffi, actually. But in any case, 6 Ferraris in all, counting various privateers, started along with 6 Talbots and 3 Maseratis. After Ascari and Villarizi both retired, Gonzalez was able to come through to take the win for Ferrari over Rosier, Etanceline, Chiron, and Whitehead. The sum of the story is that Ferrari were really dominating any non-championship race that Alfa didn't have the funds to show up to. Only when Alfa did show up did it get interesting, or when Ferrari didn't bother to show up either. The last pre-Italian Grand Prix non-championship race was the Gran Premio di Bari, through the heart of Bari in southern Italy. The Alfa Romeos did show up in the form of Fangio and Bonetto, an odd choice of 2 cars, but there you go. Plus 5 Ferraris, including Ascari, Gonzalez, and Villarizi. Farina was also present in Alfa. My bad. Bonetto was intended to enter, but didn't actually. They couldn't get his car working on time, so Fangio and Farina for Alfa, Ascari, Gonzalez, and Villarizi for Ferrari. Sorry if I've confused anyone hopelessly. Along with 3 Gordinis, 5 Talbots, and 4 Maseratis. The eventual result of the race was that Fangio was able to hold on to win ahead of Gonzalez and Taruffi, then Rosier and Gerard Cabontius in their Talbots, after Farina, Ascari, and Villarizi all retired. And that brings us to the Italian Grand Prix on the 16th of September at Monza, the home race for both of our championship contenders. It would be no surprise that they both pretty much went all out with 4 works cars showing up. Peach lost his spot in the 4th Alfa and was replaced by de Graffenried, and Alfa brought the upgraded 159M model of their car, which had, as I recall, let me consult my notes here. The M stands for Maggiorata, or enlarged. I believe they brought an even bigger and more powerful engine here, which is maybe not the only solution given their horrible fuel efficiency problems, but it's what they had. Anyway, Monza itself was built back in 1922 by the Milan Automobile Club. The high-speed ring wasn't being used at this time, given some deaths back in the 30s, and really, other than the absence of some chicanes and parabolica being curva-sued and not quite shaped the same way, it's really pretty similar to the modern Monza. In 1950, it was won by Farina for Alfa Romeo. All told, some 23 cars appeared, 4 Alfas, 7 Ferraris with the privateers, 3 Gordinis, 2 BRMs, 6 Talbot Lagos, and 1 Osca. Osca was a venture of the Maserati brothers after they sold off their original company. And this was their attempt to revive something using as a project for themselves, I guess, essentially. Pole position fell to Fangio over Farina by 0.7 of a second with a 153.2, 5.4 seconds faster than in 1950, beating out Ascari and Gonzalez. And so far, the manufacturer that had taken pole had won on every occasion in Formula One, so quite a significant blow to start with, even if they are all on the same row. Behind them, Villarizi, Taruffi, and Bonetto, and then Reg Parnell, 9 seconds down on Fangio, squeezing in his BRM. Relegating to Graffenried, who was 12 seconds down in his Alfa, then Ken Richardson in a second BRM, Simone and Trintignant in their Gordinis, followed by Manzone, Gerard Cabontus, Rosier, Chico Landi in a privateer Ferrari 375, which he managed to qualify 18 seconds down. It's 13 seconds slower than Taruffi, so make of that what you will. It's not great. Followed by Franco Roll in the Oscar, Whitehead in his obsolete Ferrari 125, LeVay in a Talbot, and on the back row, Johnny Clays and Jack Swatters in their Talbots, and Rudy Fischer in his Ferrari 212 sports car. As the actual race got underway, Trintignant proved to be... Well, there were a lot of dramas immediately before the race, let's say. Both of the BRMs developed gearbox issues and were unable to actually take the start, nor was Rudy Fischer in his Ferrari 212, and Trintignant fell sick overnight and was secretly replaced by John Beira so that they didn't lose the starting bonus money for well-known drivers at the time. Beira wore Trintignant's helmet, and nobody informed the race organizers about the switch intentionally. So, at the time for the entire race, it was assumed that Trintignant was actually the one doing the driving, that Beira really was. As the race actually finally got underway, Fangio was able to hold the lead from Farina, while Ascari lost out to Gonzalez. Landi in the privateer Ferrari was out immediately with a transmission failure on the starting grid. And by the second lap, Whitehead and de Graffenried followed with a compressor failure for de Graffenried and a magneto failure for the privateer Ferrari, even as Ascari made his way back into third ahead of Gonzalez. It was really Fangio and Farina versus 4 Ferraris chasing them already, with Bonetto not quite looking like having the pace for the time being. And on the third lap, Ascari proceeded to fire his way passed both Farina and Fangio on the big straights of Monza using the slipstream and took the lead, which he was able to keep despite the Alfas then having the slipstream themselves. On lap 4, it was Clace out with an oil pump failure, and then on lap 5, Farina, running third, developed a misfire and proceeded to drop back to the back of the pack. On lap 7, he retired as that proved entirely terminal, or slowed him down too much for it to be worth continuing. However, on lap 8, Fangio was able to get back past Ascari and retake the lead of the Italian Grand Prix, even as Swathers went out with overheating problems. By lap 10, Levey was also out with engine issues, and the initial grid had been cut to just 13 cars still running, with Fangio leading from a pack of 4 pursuing Ferraris, alone once again, as the rest of the Alfa Romeo runners dropped out for various reasons. And finally, on lap 13, luck caught up with Fangio as he picked up a puncture and dropped to 5th. Although, fortunately for him, Taruffi, who had been 5th, picked up a near blowout, rolled into the pits on his rim and kept going, but had some significant damage probably. And worse, on lap 20, Villarici also suffered a significant puncture, and which dropped him back behind Bonetto and Fangio. Fangio also got past Bonetto sometime in this period, so by the 1 quarter mark, it was a 1-2 for Ascari and Gonzalez. Fangio was back into third with his new tires and chasing after them, but they did seem to have enough pace, frankly. On lap 24, Chiron was out with an engine failure. On lap 27, Fangio made the first of 2 planned fuel stops and dropped back from the Ferraris, but he was otherwise gaining on them by this time, using the pure power of the Alfa Romeo engine on the big straights here. Meanwhile, Villarici picked up a second puncture, although he stayed ahead of Taruffi, who was really struggling with the handling of his car after that first blowout that he had suffered. Meanwhile, the Gordinis had gotten themselves into a 7-8-9, although were essentially totally dependent on retirements from the Alfas or Ferraris in order to try to make it actually into the points. And things, well, that was shortly ruined, as on lap 29, Beira and Manzone both suffered near simultaneous engine failures and were out of the race. Plus, Simone had some sort of engine issue which slowed him down, but didn't quite actually retire. Meanwhile, Bonetto stopped for fuel, first of the Alfas, and gave his car, well, no, second of the Alfas, made his fuel stop. Fangio made his couple laps prior. Bonetto made his fuel stop and gave his car to Farina, bringing Alfa's defending champion back into the race, even if the defense looked unlikely for this year. The Ferraris made their 1 fuel stops a bit early on lap 35, probably in order to stay ahead of the pursuing, gaining Fangio, which they did. And Fangio now had to make another fuel stop and probably was unlikely to catch. Whether he could have, however, is a question that will unfortunately go unanswered, as on lap 39, Fangio developed a misfire of his own, which quickly proved terminal, and he retired, leaving only Farina to represent Alfa Romeo in the race, 40 seconds behind Gonzalez and closing. Over the next 15 laps, Farina closed an average of better than 2 seconds a lap on Gonzalez, but on lap 55, 7 seconds behind Gonzalez, he had to make his second fuel stop. He immediately set off in pursuit again and would quickly set the fastest lap, and possibly more than one, but he just couldn't quite do it. He actually might have. He was closing over 2 seconds, 3 seconds a lap, but again, we won't quite know if he would have done it, because on lap 70, his engine suddenly cut on the exit from Parabolica, or rather Curva Sud, and he had to coast into the pit lane, where they found that his fuel tank was cracked and just dripping fuel all over the track. They proceeded to fill it to the brim with as much fuel as they could, in the hopes that the leak was slow enough that he could make it around the remaining 10 laps before all the fuel drained out onto the track. which is a very safe, very 1951 sort of plan. And it worked. It worked. Farina was able to hold third, but Ascari headed a Ferrari 1, 2, 4, 5, with only Farina splitting them with third in the fastest lap as Alfa Romeo self-destructed at their home race, and Ferrari won its home race in glorious fashion. So, Alberto Ascari took the win, 24.6 seconds ahead of Gonzalez. Third, the car that Bonetto had started and Farina finished a lap down, still ahead of Villarizi and then Taruffi, who had both had, of course, puncture issues themselves. Also finishing the race, only 4 other cars, Simone and his Gordini 6 laps behind, but just out of the points given the unreliability of the frontrunners. Then Rosier and Giraud Cabontu 7 and 8 laps down. Franco Roll finished in the Oscar, but was 13 laps behind. So with just one race to go, and I realize this table is getting a little large, but focus on the front or your favorite drivers. With just one race to go, Fangio had no points scored, and as a result, he still had 27. Ascari, with the win, was now at 25 and just 2 points behind going into the final race. Plus, Gonzalez, with his second place, was at 21 points and just about in the running for the championship as well. Farina sat at 17, Villarizi 15, both out of championship contention, but also running pretty well for the year. Then Taruffi with 10, and of course, numerous others. In our unofficial constructors, Alfa's finishing only third, but once again with fastest lap, meant that Ferrari, the very best Ferrari could do was finish on 33 points themselves here, if they won the final race with the fastest lap, which means they're technically still in it, but they are dependent on Alfa not to... They need to win. And it's pretty simple, really. There are all sorts of complications, but it's pretty clear, given their pace, that the season result is very likely to come down to who can win the Spanish Grand Prix. There was one non-championship race in the interim, the Goodwood Trophy on the 29th of September, which attracted mostly minor starters. Reg Parnell and his dark blue Ferrari privateer car, plus Farina and an Alfa did show up. I don't think they qualified third and fourth. I think the grid was given out randomly at Goodwood, although maybe they did for some reason. In any case, they did duly win, with Farina leading Parnell home, then Tony Rolt in a Delage, Bob Gerard in an ERA, and Sterling Moss in that Formula 2 HWM was really having quite an outstanding Formula 1 season for someone without a Formula 1 car. Wonder if he'll amount to anything one day. The final race of the season, previously the final non-championship race of the season in 1950, but this year the final championship race of the season, the Spanish Grand Prix on the 28th of October at Pedralbes. Coming in, Fangio was 2 points ahead of Ascari in the championship, 6 points ahead of Gonzalez. But because of the dropped points system at the time, it is a little more complicated than that. Fangio would have to drop 5 points, his shared first with fastest lap from France. Ascari would have to drop 3 from the same race, actually. And Gonzalez would also have to drop 3 again from the same race. The shared points thing was not actually that great for them. So, if Ascari won or finished second, with Fangio not winning, then he would win the championship. Gonzalez had to win with the fastest lap in order to have a chance, and he had to have Fangio not finishing second or first, and Ascari finishing third or lower, so the same, really. In essence, Gonzalez had to win and not have Fangio or Ascari in second. Fangio simply had to win or to beat both Ferrari drivers, or to see the Ferrari drivers not win or finish second. So, it came down to who would win, unless, of course, none of them won, because they all had to score at least a third or better to improve. Ascari, in order to improve his score by 3 points and overtake Fangio, would need to place at least second, so if he can't do that, then he doesn't win the championship no matter what Fangio does. Now, the Pedralbes circuit was built on the wide streets of the suburbs of western Barcelona. It had been a bit expanded from its original format in preparation for the World Championship event, after previously being a very popular non-championship race. The circuit came in at 6.316 kilometers, or 3.925 miles, and they would run 70 laps of it. Coming into the race, Alfa Romeo made the choice to run with pretty standard 18-inch tires, while Ferrari made the aggressive choice to bring 16-inch rear wheels, in hopes, presumably, of greater speed. So showing up would be 20 cars, 4 Alfas, 4 Ferraris, 3 Gordinis, 6 Talbots, and 3 Maseratis. A pretty standard lineup, really, for the year. In qualifying, Ascari took pole position with a 2:10.59, 1.68 seconds clear of Fangio in his Alfa. Then Gonzalez and Farina for a Ferrari Alfa front row. Then Villarizi, De Graffenried, and Taruffi to continue the pattern, followed by Bonetto to finish it. Then Manzon, Simon, and Trintignant in their Gordinis, which at this point in the season were, I don't know if they had brought upgrades or not, it's kind of hard to tell, but they almost must have, because they were clearly faster than the Talbots at this point in the season, even if they were still well behind the Ferraris and Alfas. In any case, then, the Talbots of Chiron, Eton-Celine, Giraud Cabontus, Clays, and Grignard. The local Spanish Maserati entries of Paco Godia and Juan Hover. Prince Bira in his Maserati, which was powered by an Oscar engine, as he was part of that project. And Louis Rosier and his Talbot, dead last for some reason. Generally, he was about the strongest of the Talbot drivers, but apparently this was not his track, because he was well off the pace here. Juan Hover of the local Spanish Maserati drivers did not even make the start with an engine failure. As they actually reached the start, Ascari kept the lead and Gonzalez fired into second, with Fangio dropping to fourth behind Gonzalez and Farina. Bonetto again made a lightning start, not quite into the lead this time, but passed Taruffi, De Graffenried, and Villarici into fifth. Unfortunately for Ferrari, just one lap in, Gonzalez proceeded to spin and dropped 4 places. Meanwhile, Prince Bira retired at the back as his Oscar engine blew up immediately. On the third lap, Fangio proceeded to pass Farina, setting the fastest lap in the process. And then on lap 4, passed Ascari for the lead. However, Ascari was planning to no-stop the race. Fangio had to stop at least once and maybe twice. By lap 5, Chiron was out with an ignition failure, and it was rapidly becoming clear that Ferrari had a problem. Their 16-inch rear wheels were degrading at a much higher pace than Alfa's. Normally at this time, there weren't even really tire-specific pit stops. They were changed when fuel stops were made, but it wasn't a big problem. However, in this case, Ferrari was absolutely chewing through its tires. And any question of whether or not they might have to make a pit stop became very clear when on lap 6, Taruffi threw the tread on his tire and had to make an immediate pit stop just 6 laps into the race. He was followed just 2 laps later by Villarici, even as Giraud Cabontus went out after hitting a stray dog, leading to his retirement. Yeah, that's a thing that happens a lot in 1951, unfortunately. Shortly after Villarici, Ascari, and then eventually Gonzalez also threw their tires off their rims and had to make pit stops in an absolutely disastrous scene for Ferrari. And, well, it was a bit of a chaotic pit stop phase that all happened on different laps, but by lap 15, the nutshell was that Ascari was back into third, only to go off into a sand trap and have to make an extra pit stop, which meant he was running 7th. And in the midst of absolute disaster for Ferrari, Alfa Romeo found itself running 1, 2, 3, 4, with Fangio in first, set to easily win the championship. Gonzalez, Villarizi, Ascari, and Taruffi 5, 6, 7, 8, still struggling with heavy tire degradation despite whatever Ferrari could do to try to mitigate it, and they could do by going easy on the tires. And so the situation looked pretty hopeless, but everyone kept on lapping around. By lap 24, Grignard was the next out with an engine failure. On lap 25, de Graffenried had to make a pit stop with steam pouring out of his hood. He actually kept going after repairs, but dropped down to 8th. And Trintignant was able to pass the slow-running Bonetto. Not Trintignant. Gonzalez was able to pass the slow-running Bonetto and make his way up to 3rd. Still, however, behind Fangio and Farina. Trintignant proceeded to go out on lap 26 with an engine failure. On lap 29, Fangio made his fuel stop with no problems, the first of 2, as it would ultimately be, staying ahead of Gonzalez. He was briefly behind Farina, but Farina then came in for his stop the next lap, staying 2nd. Meanwhile, de Graffenried, after his engine problem, whatever it was past Taruffi and back into 7th as the Ferraris continued to really struggle to preserve their tires. And just a lap later, on lap 30, Taruffi lost not just a tire, but an entire wheel and was out of the race. On lap 35, Ascari had to make a 2nd tire stop for the race, albeit he still made a net gain as Bonetto and de Graffenried then made their fuel stops, and Villarizi began developing an engine issue, a misfire, and the result was, after Ascari made a tire stop, Bonetto and de Graffenried made fuel stops, and Villarizi began losing pace, that Ascari somehow or other came out 4th, despite his extra tire stop, still behind Gonzalez, and way behind Fangio and Farina. On lap 38, Claes crashed right through the straw barriers on the edge of the track and retired. And, well, barring disaster for the Alfa Romeos, although Ferrari had fought their way back to a 3-4-5, the race was still all but over, with Alfa in a pretty dominant position given Ferrari's tire troubles. On lap 49, Simon retired with an engine issue. Villarizi's engine issue proved terminal with an ignition failure, and he retired. And Manzone had the same engine problems as the rest of the Gordinis, but was able to keep going, albeit in a pretty crippled fashion. The Ferraris were showing somewhat better pace by now, but nonetheless, on lap 52, when Fangio made his 2nd pit stop, he was able to stay in the lead. Farina made his 2nd pit stop a lap later and did drop behind Gonzalez, demonstrating that Gonzalez at least had some threatening pace. But due to having to make a 2nd tire stop, Ascari was quite a ways behind Gonzalez, actually. And the last 18 laps of the race would almost continue the sort of anticlimax of Ferrari destruction, self-destruction. In any case, Fangio came home to win the Spanish Grand Prix by 54 seconds over Gonzalez, then Farina, and then Ascari, who finished 2 laps down, limping in 4th. Bonetto also grabbing points, and then de Graffenried, with Rosier best of the rest after starting last on the grid, so made up for the qualifying pace in the race. So the final podium, Fangio, Gonzalez, and Farina, then Ascari and Bonetto 2 laps down. Other finishers, de Graffenried 4 laps behind, Rosier 6, Etoncelin and Manzone 7 laps down, and Paco Godia in the Spanish Maserati 10 laps behind. The final championship results for the year. Fangio claims 4 points compared to what he had with the first year, and finishes on 31 points plus 6 dropped points. Ascari gains nothing with his 3 points here, finishes on 25 plus 3 dropped points. The second place for Gonzalez does improve his standing, and he finishes third with 24 points, barely behind Ascari in the end. Farina ends up with 19, slightly improving his score here. Villarizi with 15 after a consistent but not outstanding season. Then Taruffi with 10, Bonetto 7, Parnell 5, Fagioli 4, and of course Sanisi 3. Well, Parnell with 5 was the fastest non-Ferrari or Alfa driver, but he actually grabbed the bulk of his points in France, where I believe he was driving. Yes, where he was driving a privateer Ferrari, so his 2 in Britain were the only ones he took while not driving a Ferrari or Alfa. So really, it must be said that, other than the Americans, of course, who I'm sort of ignoring here, Louis Rosier with 3 points from Belgium was effectively the best driver not in a Ferrari or Alfa Romeo for the second year running, and only took 3 points, which really shows how harsh the point system was, especially with Ferrari and Alfa running 4 cars each at this time, which makes it really hard for anyone else to score points. Meanwhile, in our unofficial constructors, Alfa takes the title by 5 points from Ferrari, having won 4 races to Ferrari's 3, which, with only 4 results counting, pretty much seals it automatically. Other than Curtis Kraft and Sherman Offenhauser from America, Talbot and BRM are the only other constructors to score points, which is pretty hard on Gordini, who were actually faster than Talbot for most of at least the second half of the season, but didn't quite walk away with any points to show for it. So as we reach the end of the season, just a few notes. Fangio outqualified Farina at every single race they did together, 7-0. He was also faster than Ascari by a 5-2 margin, while Ascari beat Gonzalez 4-1. In races, that's a lot dicier because of so many retirements, but Fangio beat Farina 3 out of 4 and Ascari 2 out of 3 on Gonzalez. In races that they both finished, Fangio was ultimately ahead of Ascari in 3 out of 5. All of the top 5 drivers who finished in the championship actually finished at least 5 races in the points, and therefore ended up dropping points for the year. And immediately after the Spanish Grand Prix, there was dramatic news as Alfa Romeo announced their departure from the sport after winning 2 consecutive championships on financial reasons. You may recall they had been running these 2 seasons both on a shoestring, using almost entirely parts made before World War II, and the money now finally ran out entirely, and they were forced to depart Formula One as undefeated champions, effectively. For the next year, it looked like only Ferrari would have a decently competitive Formula One car, and as a result, it was decided that the 1952 World Championship of Drivers would be run to Formula 2 regulations in an effort to attract additional entries, which was hoped to create a more competitive environment. On the other hand, with Alfa Romeo gone, Ferrari was still the only big budget team left, in effect. So, well, you'll have to tune in for the next video on 1952 in order to find out how that went, or look it up, given it happened 70 years ago. But in any case, thanks for watching my history of the 1952 Formula One season. I hope you enjoyed it. Remember to like and subscribe if you did, and hopefully we'll see you in another month for the 1952 season. Thank you, and goodbye.